Bugs in policy we're gonna cover in a little bit, but another set of denials you'll find from SELinux are things like execmem being thrown in exec heap. That usually means that your programs weren't built right. They're being built with libraries that require access that they don't need. If you're really interested in that, Ulrich Drepper had a really good paper on how to make it so that you weren't throwing SELinux exec heap and execmem denials, because it's really a fault in your program. It's not a fault in our checking. So let's move on to policy basics. Then, and of course, the you've been compromised one. Writing to the configuration store or policy or shadow is probably a bad idea. So policy basics and policy. What is policy? Policy are the rules that say what happens in the system. We've seen this before with all the configuration, but now we're actually going to put this to meaning. We're going to say, what does it mean to write a rule about what's going on in the system? So it's the rules, that's the TE file that I told you about earlier. It's the mappings, which are those FC files, which are the file mappings, context mappings to paths, and then mappings of users and roles. What users get what roles have what types. And as we saw earlier, this is all in etc SELinux, and then a folder titled whatever the policy name is. And you can get the policy name with your SE status command that we saw on slide 4 of the presentation. So let's actually put this back onto slideshow mode, because it's a lot easier for me to change pages. So let's look at the policy directory, what was in it. So we poked around in it a little bit earlier. So policy is your compiled and loaded policy. So this, you'll see, policy dot some version number, and that's the version number that it was compiled to. That is the file that gets opened and read into the kernel byte for byte, that the kernel then sanity checks and loads up in as its policy data. Modules, which we saw earlier, is all the active modules that are in there. Those .pp files, if you make a policy module and use SE module to install it, it's going to get tossed in that directory. And then contexts are all those file context mappings that I showed you earlier. Except if you poke around in there, you're going to find out there's a lot more than file context. There's the context mappings for pretty much anything that needs context mappings in the system. And I don't cover it in this talk because it's pretty much a topic in and of itself. But there are things called user space object managers. So, for example, the X server can be user space object manager. If you've heard of SE Postgres, that has SELinux style protections in Postgres database. So you could write SELinux style rules for your DTD rules and your DTM rules in policy in the thing. So I worked with Quigley for a little bit on that. And what's really cool is you could have kind of like a policy enforced all the way from the web app using his mod SELinux stuff all the way down to the kernel, and have policy governing modifications of rows and tables, modifications of tables, adding and deleting of tables, all sorts of fun stuff like that. And those kind of rules, those context mappings, go into that context directory as well, but those aren't pertaining to the SELinux kernel enforcement stuff. That's what are called user space object managers. For example, what's another good one? There's a couple other good ones as well, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So here's your first look at a type enforcement rule. This is what it looks like, allow. Pretty much allow is what you're going to use 99% of the time. It is the only thing that actually grants access in the system. Audit allow does not grant access. It just audits when something happens. This is what says this domain type can access this object type of this object class with these permissions. So for example, the first line there says user T can access password exec T file with the execute permission. This is what allows the user shell to execute the passwd program. The next one under that says that that passwd exec file is a valid entry point for the passwd domain. It's what allows us to become the password program and actually modify files. And then the last one down there is important as well, because it's what so even if we write a type transition rule, if we don't write a rule allowing the type transition, it will never happen. So that all three of those rules right there go into allowing the user to execute the password program as the password domain. So we're going to write rules like this, but most of the time, since we're going to be accessing pre-existing objects in the system, we'll actually be using interfaces instead. So the transition rules, there's two types of transition rules that we're going to be concerned with when writing policies. One were those file creation transition rules that we saw earlier. When Apache created a file in var run, it created it with Apache's var run type, as opposed to just the generic var run type. And then the other one is what we just saw, which is allowing one domain to transition into another when executing a file. So you're not going to write these transition rules by hand. There's plenty of interfaces in the policy that allow you to just specify them without actually writing them. And to be fair, the tools that we're going to use to generate the stub policies that we're going to work from make these interfaces for you for your own domain. So you can poke and prod around in the interface to see what's happening, but you're seldom going to write these rules on your own. So ftransferd, this is our dummy application. It is a simple file getting daemon. It will transfer files. You give it a user, you give it a file name, and it will look in that user's home directory for a folder called public_ftransfer or ftransferd, I forget. It's in the documentation for it, and pull the file out of there. It can access any user regardless of whether or not you would have access to that user's files. So it has no security checks on it and no permission checking whatsoever. So if I am, user Dave and I have no access to SEDemo and I say give me SEDemo file foo, it will give me file foo. It has no problem doing that. The daemon runs as root. It has full super user access to the system. So this another thing that this is supposed to show is that SELinux can confine the root user as well. And in more advanced courses, I would actually have you map the root user to a confined user, and he wouldn't have all powerful access anymore, despite the fact that he gets it through being UID 0. So when writing a policy, things that we need to know: what is my program supposed to do? What resources that the system already has is it supposed to access? And what kind of accesses to those resources does it need? So for example, we need to read from a directory in the user's home directory, which means we're going to need access to the user's home directory, specifically a specific directory in it, and read those files. We write our output to syslog, which means we're going to need access to write to syslog. So we're going to need to put that in our policy. And we need to bind and communicate through a TCP port. So there's obviously more to it, but from a basics perspective, those are three things that this program does that we're going to need to make sure are in the policy so we can actually do our work. So let's do policy basics. And this is where we're going to do lots of hands-on stuff. We're not going to be talking, we're not going to be going through a lot of slides. There's just basically, as a matter of fact, the next one's a completely blank slide that you guys have to then work with. So developing new policies. If you're on a RHEL 5 system, you need a package called SELinux Policy Devel. It's in SELinux Policy for all modern Fedora and RHEL systems. These will put all your policy headers, including a make file, which will build the policy binaries for you, in user share SELinux Devel. So you can poke and prod around that and see all the interfaces. If you want to inspect the interfaces that the policy gives you by hand, that's a very good thing to go through. It also has the XML documentation that all the man pages are built from. You need a tool called check policy. This is your policy compiler. It will take your policy files and turn them into a .pp package. And then if you want the policy sources, you can get them for the SE policy source RPM, or you can go to the ref policy website and grab them from the Git repository. Something that's important to notice: Red Hat puts a lot of patches on top of what comes out of the ref policy repo. There are a lot of patches there. There's kind of a little philosophical divide because the Traces people come out of the accreditation and government security background, which means they're more on the side of things need to be more secure and more structured. Dan is, I need this to work so people stop turning it off. So I'm going to not be as strict with the rules I put in, and if it makes the user's life easier and it's not that big of a security trade-off, maybe I'm going to put a rule in the Red Hat policy that's not in ref policy. So you're going to find a slightly more permissive policy in the Red Hat policy. Dan always puts, every release of Red Hat, he always takes all of his patches, posts them to the development list. They don't necessarily take them all, but they take some of them. So you'll see a lot of the stuff pushed back into ref policy as well. But if you don't want to go with the Red Hat policy, if you want to make your own policy, the ref policy might be a good place to start. So I mentioned things called interfaces. So the existing policy language is kind of a monster. It is a conglomeration of make files and M4. I don't know if you've had to use much M4 outside of, say, a send mail conf file, But M4 as a language is difficult to use at best. So these interfaces, and your policy module will have them as well in case someone else needs to access your files, are the .if files that are in the policy. And these are basically abstractions, so no one needs to know what types you actually use. So if you have an interface that says access ftransferd files, in there it would actually make the rules saying this type can access ftransferd content T type. And if at any point you changed what the underlying type was, you wouldn't actually have to change it in all your policy modules. You just have to relink them at link time, and it would link them all back together. So you can view documentation on all the interfaces under that devel directory, under policy help. There's a bunch of XML in there that gets built into DocBook, I believe, if you build it. And that'll give you descriptions of all the interfaces and stuff like that. So, so here's where we're going to start messing around with things. You have two options here. If you do not like using IDEs, you do not need to use Eclipse slide. If you're using my VM, you already have it. If you got my materials in the slide directory, there's all the packages you need to install for that. It makes life a little bit easier. However, in terms of our first step, it's not going to be much different because they both ask the same questions for setting up the stub domain, the stub policy that we're going to start from. Policy gen tool, if you ever see that on a system, do not use it. It's old. It doesn't work very well. So system config SELinux has a nice little GUI front end for generating policy, and there's also the SEPolgen tool. So I'm actually going to do both. I'm going to show you SEPolgen, but I'm going to do it through the GUI because the text interface isn't so good. And I'm going to also make a module for you in slide. And from that point on, you can choose to use whatever you want. If you do it with SEPolgen GUI, then you're going to be using some sort of other text editor besides Eclipse to edit it from there on out. So let's go take a look at this. Let me get a new launch. So I need SEPolgen, and I want the GUI, SEPolgen. We'll just do system config SELinux. All right, so we want a policy module. We're going to add a new one. Actually, no, not add. We want a new one. And this is going to pop up our policy generation tool at some point. Should. All right, so ftransferd is a standard init daemon. We're not using xinitd or anything like that to load it up. So we're going to select standard init daemon. We're going to go forward one. The name is ftransferd. The executable, let me look in the install real quick and see what I install it to normally. What is that? Oh, yep, ftransferd. And now let's go to Demystifying SELinux Part II. ftransferd, ftrans. Now I need the make file. I install it where? I install it to user local bin ftransferd. So user local bin ftransferd. The init script is etc rc.d init.d ftransferd. Is that right? rc.d init.d ftransferd. Okay. So go forward. I'm going to say allow it to bind on all unreserved ports. However, if I wanted to do specific ports here, I could specify a particular port range. So this process will bind to anything over 1024. And you're going to say, well, I thought you said we couldn't put mappings of ports for things that were already mapped. Well, this is going to do a little magic behind the scenes. In the policy, this is going to write a rule that says I'm allowed to bind to what's called an unreserved port type, but it's not really a type. It's that attribute that we were mentioning earlier that allows you to group a whole bunch of types under one alias. So basically, there's going to be a rule that says I can bind to all unreserved ports. And you're not even going to see the rule. You're just going to basically see the interface that allows it. So I'm pretty sure we only need TCP. I don't connect to any ports. I'm only binding on them. I write syslog messages. I don't need any files in temp. I don't use dbus. I don't use audit messages. I don't interact with the terminal. And I don't send email. Add files that it manages. It doesn't manage any files. There are no booleans for it. And we're going to write the policy to home SEdemo. So now let's go back into the SEdemo home directory. Maybe transfer D policy, move F transfer D star to F transfer D policy. So let's go to F transfer D policy. And we have the beginning of a policy here. We have a script that will, if this was a user application, what it would do is it would clear the logs, start it up, have you do some work. Once it terminates, it would scrape the logs for audit to allow messages, and then it would spit out a new policy module for you. We're not going to do that because we're actually doing a system daemon instead, so it's a little bit harder for the script to do that on its own. So, but let's just look inside these files real quick. Let me make this bigger too. The vimf. So if you notice, there's 3 files there. Our TE, which is our type enforcement rules, our IF, which is our interfaces that we're going to expose to other modules, and our FC, which is our file context. So in this case, it did a lot of work for us to start out. It made our domain type, ftransferd_t, the type that's placed on our executable on disk. So this is what allows us to do that type transition rule into the right domain, right? By default, it's making our domain permissive. So if you want to do this in policy, you can. You don't have to. So I noticed, I said earlier, you can take the entire server and put it into permissive mode. In this, we can do individual domains as permissive mode. So let's say we want the entire system, except for our one application, to be made permissive. You can specify it in the policy here as a rule, which it has here, or the other option is you can use SEmanage permissive to take individual types and put them into permissive mode. So that allows you to, say, deploy a new application while keeping the rest of the server enforcing, which is very useful. We got some other stuff here. Here's the type for our init script, which is going to allow us to write the transition rule from init to the application domain. And there's a macro here that it added for us that says, this is an init script file. And with whatever that means behind the scenes, you can look into it and see what it means if you want to, but from a development perspective, you just need to know, I've marked this init file as being an init file. And for applications that need to manage init files or need to execute init files, now it gets the ability to do that because I used that macro. So it's generating some more stuff for us. To be honest, I am 99% sure, I'm not even 90, I'd say 95% sure that these first 2 rules here are so that we can talk to syslog. Because I'm pretty sure the Unix stream socket work is what you need to write to our syslog daemon. And then some other default network stuff. So that's basically what we're going to bind to a bunch of ports added here. Additional stuff that it generates. Oddly, we didn't say we had a config file, but it seemed to have put the rule to allow us to read config files in there. I'm assuming if we put that we had a config file, it would have created special rules and types for our config file for us. Our message logging and read localization support, because you kind of need that for any process. So this is the base module that we're going to start with. Let's work on really quick. Let me open up Eclipse, and I'll show you how to do it from the Eclipse slide GUI. And then once you do that, you guys can make your policy module, and then we can move on to the next step. That was weird. It seems they have far more interesting material to cover. All right, so we're just going to make a workspace. Doesn't matter where the workspace is. We're going to make a new project, just like we would with any other Eclipse thing. If you notice, with slide installed, we have this little slide folder there. We're going to make a slide project. Now, we're going to call this ftransfer D slide. Oh, we'll just call it ftransfer D. Now, project type. If we wanted to build a full monolithic policy from the ref policy sources, or even just a modular policy from the ref policy sources, we'd select full ref policy project. We're not doing that. We're always going to be writing modules. Unless we need to modify the base policy for some reason, we're going to want a policy module. Click Next. That's the location of our SELinux devel stuff. Now, this hasn't actually given us a module yet. This has just given us a project. So after that, we right-click on here, New Slide Module. And then we're going through all the other stuff, ftransfer D. Summary must be specified. Policy for ftransfer D. Next. Path, that was user, local, bin, ftransfer D. We don't have a configuration file. We don't have our own log file, but we could have had that. Allow all TCP networking. Use the syslog. That's odd. Why is it type file? That's right. That's interesting. Why doesn't it have that word? Oh, that's because there's the dropdown. Daemon. That's what I need. Daemon is. It cleared it for me. Daemon access network. Daemon startup with init script. Use the syslog. User local bin ftransfer D. All right, so that all seems okay. Although I'm kind of concerned that it didn't ask me where my init script was. So we'll see how the policy that this generates is different. So there's the module, and if you notice, on the bottom we have our IF, our TE, and our FCs. Yeah, so this one didn't do as good of a job because it didn't actually generate the init daemon stuff for me. But as you notice, it's created a quite different policy. I don't know why it added those two differently, but you can use either to start your policy, but at this point it's going to be the starting point. We're going to have to install ftransfer D, start messing around with it, and try and access the files. And at that point, we're going to get denial spec. So who does not have the module created that intends on making it? So personally, what I would do is I would start from, and this makes it complicated, generate it with SEPolgen, make the project with Eclipse slide, and dump the SEPolgen generated files into the Eclipse slide project. Because I personally like the policy that was started with SEPolgen better than the one that was created with slide, but I like the user interface of slide better in terms of searching for interfaces to put into my code. So let me see. And to create the module with the SEPolgen GUI kind of thing, you do SELinux system config SELinux, system-config SELinux, go to policy module and click new, and it'll bring up the wizard for you. But something, so if you'll notice on the interfaces here, something that you'll notice is ref policy is structured based on the layers in which the interaction occurs. So those interfaces up there, there's an admin layer, apps, kernel, roles, services. It kind of sections them off at that layers. And when we created the the policy here, we had an option to put it in one of those layers. So you don't need to do it, but if you want to be, like if you know yours is a service and you wanted to put it in the service layer, you could have done that. But yeah, it's really convenient to browse through stuff here. So for example, let's say you needed to do some stuff with Courier, like read the Courier spool. You know, you look under services, you look under Courier, and you see, oh, here's an interface that allows me to read its spool. And that's the kind of benefit that you're going to get from the SE, the slide GUI, the ease of just like browsing through this stuff. But that's the start. What's in the console? Why did it write a policy version 10 file? That doesn't seem right. How many slides do I have left, and how long do we have? It sends at 12:30? Yeah. All right, so we have 30 minutes to write policy. So this is pretty much the rinse and repeat recipe for making policy. It sounds easy, but in reality, it takes a while. So we went through all these slides. Next important thing is going to be audit to allow. So once everyone gets the module set up in there, feeling comfortable with the fact that they have it in slide or whatever they want to do with it, just let me know, and we'll then cover how to take all this junk and turn it into policy. Any questions? Doesn't have to be questions. It could also be complaints. So I give my VMs more RAM and CPUs than most people have on their computers, so that's why they're kind of faster. Like at home, I easily dump 8 gigs of memory and 8 cores to any VM I'm working on. Because for the longest time, they wouldn't give me a Linux box at work, so what I did was I basically took all my Windows resources, put it on a Linux VM, and ran my Linux VM full screen the entire time. So. Yeah, that might be the easiest thing to do. Or you could just edit them by hand. You don't necessarily need to, especially considering the next step of this is going to be run the program, collect our messages, and then from there run them through audit to allow, which is basically a program that takes the audit logs and generates policy from them. And then we're going to review those changes and add them to our base policy to our policy module as we see fit. So in reality, it's almost impossible, unless you're someone like Chris Pepinito, who's been working on the policy since it was made, or Steve Smalley, who manages to commit everything SELinux to memory just because of who he is. It's really impossible to know all the specifics about policy. You can come close, but to know everything about it is hard. So that's why audit to allow just gives you kind of that starting point. And then it's up to you to learn more about the policy and make an informed decision on, is it really smart to add this rule? Is it smart to add that rule? And there's always the mailing list if you can't answer that question for yourself to say, I generated this policy for this application. It's saying to do these things. Is it really smart to do those things? My laptop screen is kind of throwing me for a loop because it's still on East Coast time, so I think it's 3 o'clock, but it's not. So after you're done with that, what you're going to need to do also is go into the directory for the talk, Part 2, go into the ftransferd directory, run make. That's going to build the daemon and the client for you, and it's also going to build the policy module that's with it. What you need to do, though, is you need to make install ftransferd. So that's just, and you also need to be root. Now make sure you do underscore ftransferd and not just make install, because make install will also install that policy module. And we don't want to use that policy module. We want to use the one that we're writing ourselves. Now the cool thing is because, actually no, this isn't cool. This is actually kind of broken at the moment. Since I only ran make install ftransferd, it only installed the binaries. The problem is it doesn't have any file context mappings for those binaries yet because we never installed a policy module, right? So ideally what you'd want to do is you'd want to install your policy module first, which you can use with SE module -I think it is, and then the policy module name. Let's just double check that. Yeah, -I for install. And you want to do that first, because then that sets up those file context entries for you. That sets up the, the user local bin ftransferd is labeled with the appropriate type. And then when you do install will actually look into the SELinux policy store and say, what should this file have been labeled? And will set the file down with the appropriate label at install time. So you can do an uninstall underscore ftransferd to remove the files and then reinstall them after you've done your policy module. But step 1, install the policy module so that the init file and the daemon file get labeled properly. Step 2, install them so they're actually in the right place. And then from there, we can start working on the policy module. So is everyone, just let me know when everyone's at that point. So actually, let me do what I just told you to do on my end. Make uninstall ftransferd. So let's make -f user share SELinux devel make file. So if you want to build your policy from the command line, you use make -F to specify the file that you're using for your make file, and you do this from inside your policy directory, and then under user share SELinux devel, there's a make file in there. Is it -f? Yeah, it's -f, I think. Yep. Now this will build your policy module. Now I'm really concerned why it's making my minimum version 10. My policy version should be 24. So that's SELinux. And I know there is an answer for this because I posted a big write-up on Google Plus about it. Policy version, policy store. Why is it only policy version 10? I'm kind of concerned about that. When generating final link to expand the policy by default, SE Manager will set the policy version to policy as given in that. Change the setting if a different version is necessary. So let's just, for the hell of it, SE module -I ftransfer-d pp, and let's see what happens. Oh, that's because I need to be root. SE module -I, SE demo, ftransfer-d policy, ftransfer-d pp. Let's see if this throws some complaints at me. The problem is doing this takes a while because I don't have the slide in here. I have a slide in another deck that I've used for other presentations, but what happens is you get all these policy files. They all get concatenated into one big policy, which then gets relinked by the policy linker, which then gets loaded into the kernel. So installing a policy module takes a little while. All right, so it didn't complain, which is good. Now I want to make install ftransfer-d. That's good. Now let's check out the labels on these, make sure they're right. Etc rc.d, init.d, ftransfer-d, init. Oh, that's not good. Why is it that? Ftransfer-d. I'm in the wrong directory, that's why. Let's check this out real quick. ftransfer-d dot file context. So that should have been laid down with the right context. Etc rc.d init-d. Oh, maybe those dots need to be. Let me check my other policy. I think those dots might actually need to be escaped because they're actually valid in the thing. Demystifying Part II. Transfer-d policy. ftransfer-d.fc. Yep, that's exactly the problem. Because dots are valid for the regex matching, so I need to escape them so that they actually work properly. So let's go back to our policy rule, and make sure you do that in your policies as well. If you've already generated the policy file, go into your .fc file and escape those dots for the rc and the init, rc.d and the init.d. Otherwise, you could escape them in your policy generation. So ftransfer policy, we want SE module. SE module. See what our module's name is. It should be called ftransfer-d. Yep, ftransfer-d. So we want SE module -d ftransfer-d. Fix this in our file context file. Need to escape those. Transfer. DFC. So now let's go back to over here. We need to rerun our. Oh no, it was over here that I need to rerun that. That wasn't. We need to rebuild our policy module. All right, we do that, and then I come back over here. Reinstall our policy module. Make on then install ftransferd, make install ftransferd. This will reinstall them with the right location, etc rc.d, init.d, ftransferd. Why do you not have the right label? Match path con etc rc.d, init.d, ftransferd. Okay, well that's just fine. Compare that with this one. Demystifying SELinux Part II. etc rc.d, init.d, ftransferd, ftransferd, init exec t. So that's right. That should be good. Use my pre-built policy, which seems to work a little bit better. All right. Is anyone else having the same problem with it not getting the right context? So oddly enough, I don't know what the difference between those two policy binaries were, but it assigns it the right context now. All right. So what step is everyone on? You guys want to just take the last 15 minutes for questions? Or is there anything you'd like me to talk about that I haven't talked about?
When I'm trying to install the policy,
Yeah.
it's actually showing with an error at the end that it was killed.
Really?
How much should we ran one on?
What is the exact error that it's saying? Killed?
That's tracing it. It's killed.
That's really weird. I don't know why I would have done that. There were issues with memory consumption earlier on, but I don't think those have been an issue for a long time. And that's with the SE module -I on your policy file? And you're running it on the .pp file? So let's work on just adding some more rules to the policy, even if it's not working quite right now. But it showcases some of the things that you'll need to do. For example, we need a content type for our content, right? So if we look, we want to create a new content type, Vim. Let's go back to SE demo. Transfer policy. So this policy just basically covers us starting up, binding to ports, and accessing a few files, but it doesn't actually cover the restricting to the content. So ideally, you're going to, just like with the Apache policy, we're going to want a context that governs ftransferd content, right? Just like we had on the public HTML, we're going to have public ftransferd, and we're going to have that as well. So if we look, policy. At this policy, we're actually going to add a new content type. So in this section, we're going to see that we're going to add a new type, which is simple. It's type and then the type name with a semicolon after it. ftransferd content T. And this is a files type, which means by saying it's a files type, anything that can back up file type content, like I think Amanda's backup or whatever it is, the things that are marked as backup programs or programs that need to manage the entire file system have access to it. And another important thing is because this content is going to be shared from the user's home directory, we need to specify that this content belongs in the user's home directory, which is the user DOM home content interface there. So from that point out, it's not very many modifications to the bottom half of this. So one thing, who knows what the capability subsystem is? So in addition to SELinux and your DAC permissions, there's also capabilities. And one of the capabilities, specifically the capability that gives you the ability to access any file you want as super user, is what's called the DAC override capability. And what's interesting is capabilities themselves are also an object class within SELinux. So if a process needs a particular capability, it has to be allowed in SELinux policy. So the rules down here, we'll start, the last 5 rules are what's going to allow us to access any files that we need to as the root user, and specifically access the files that we need in the SELinux, in the ftransfer content T folder types. So the first allow rule there is we're granting the ability for this process to have certain capabilities. And those capabilities are going to be DAC read search, which is what's going to allow it to look into the other user's home directory, and more specifically, something called DAC override, which is the permission that gives root its ability to do what it does. It's what allows it to say, I don't care what the DAC permissions for this are, I'm just going to get access to it anyway. So we put those in, and that will now allow us to start poking and prodding around in individual users' home directories. Now, underneath that, we're going to see 2 other interfaces that SELinux, that the policy provides. Search home dirs, file search home. So these are the permissions to search home directories, because all the users' home directories are labeled user home T. And we're going to give ftransferd's domain the ability to access those, which is what the first macro is. After that, not just access it, but we need to list the contents of it, because we break the distinction between being able to enter a directory and actually being able to list the contents of a directory. So the second one there basically says, I need to be able to list the contents of users' home directories. And if we were looking through the interface thing in the slide, we would have seen plenty of instances of macros that meet this criteria, that is user home something. And then it would have the various level. If I just need to read, if I need to write, if I need to manage it completely, which means creating and deleting files from it, it would give you a list of macros that you could potentially use for this. We just need to list the contents in the user's home directory so we can get to that public ftransferd directory. And then the last 2, these look like interfaces, but they're not. There's a second set of kind of interface-like things in the policy called patterns, and these are just basic building blocks. So list dirs pattern is all the permissions needed to be able to list the contents of a directory. read files pattern is all the permissions needed to be able to read from files, because it's not, surprisingly, it's not just read to be able to open and read a file. There's a bunch of permissions associated with it. Like, I think you need open, get at, or read, and probably one other. I forget what it is. But these are just basically saying that the ftransferD daemon can have access to those, the content type there. And this policy will give you basically a bare bones policy to start from for running ftransferD securely. Now, if you want to add things, like let's say you had instead of passing all the configuration parameters on the command line, you had a file under etc. You'd have to go back into this policy. You'd have to, or go into slide and say, we now have a config file under etc. and it has this type, and we'll put that into the file context file. We'll create an interface for it if we want other people to be able to modify that. And inside the policy, we're going to have to find the appropriate interfaces for that. So, sorry the policy section wasn't as in-depth as the other sections, but last time I did this, it was a full-day course to cover this amount of material. So, no, yeah, to be honest, the policy development, Traces teaches a 5-day policy development course, just policy development. They assume that you actually know the basics. So, then again, they wrote the ref policy, so they kind of know it pretty well. But if there's any questions, you can feel free to email me. Please remember to rate the talk on the website so that they know what's going on. Also, if you look at the end of the slides that you had, I'll put it up just for now. Actually, we'll go over the last 3 slides real quick because it's basically places you can find extra resources. And if you didn't know, do you want to know what the vulnerability is since we didn't go over it? There's no path sanitization on the input that you get from the client. So you could .. your way out to etc password or etc shadow and try and grab the file there. And without the SELinux policy, you won't actually get it. You'll actually get the file because you have DAC override running as root. So last 4 slides that are useful. These are all the tools that we've covered, plus a few that we haven't. AU report and audit AU report and audit to Y give you additional more audit information. We've done SE module, SE manage, get SE bool, SE search I showed you earlier, which allowed me to find those rules for HTTPD on user T. SE diff allows you to take 2 policy files and diff them and see what rules are different in them. APOL, which I opened up and we never actually looked at, has the ability to point and click around and query the policy. Policy generation tools, audit to allow. Something very important when you use audit to allow, there's a -R option. That will generate ref policy interfaces instead of raw allow rules. So if there's 6 rules that are met by a ref policy interface, it will try and use that instead. It keeps the policy much cleaner and much easier to read. And then the GUI tools there. So external resources, docs.fedora project, SELinux wiki, Traces' website. The SELinux by example book is dated, but still pretty accurate. There's another book that I still, unfortunately, have to review 2 chapters on while I'm here, so we can actually get it published, is the SELinux cookbook that's going to be out by Pact Publishing. I do not get any money from it, so don't think I'm shilling for these people. It's just, unfortunately, it's the most up-to-date and relevant reference I've read on SELinux in probably the last 5 years. So there's actually another one by Pact Publishing as well. I haven't read it, but one of the other SELinux guys says it's really good. I think it's like the Admitting SELinux or something like that. I'll have to find the name of it. SELinux Project Wiki, Dan Walsh's blog, very good. He always posts like the latest advances in SELinux and policy development and stuff like that. If you need to ask in-depth questions, Fedora has an SELinux mailing list. The NSA has an SELinux mailing list. And those are good places to get information. Yeah, Dan Walsh is from Red Hat. Dan Walsh is the user space / policy guy at Red Hat. And also, I forget Miroslav's last name, but he's been working with Dan a lot lately. But he's at Red Hat too. And while this doesn't actually tell the OSCON people anything, it tells me a lot. If you want to just read the QR code, I promise you it's not going to send you anywhere horrible. It's a Google Doc, which is a survey form for the individual talk. If you want to put in some comments, complaints, criticisms, anything you'd like in there. I'm more than happy to read them, even if they are saying how incredibly horrible I am at this. So please go to the OSCON page, rate the talk, however you want to rate it. I don't particularly care. I think they just want feedback. And this is for my own personal use if you feel like doing that as well. There is an email box in there. It's completely optional. To be fair, I don't even remember why I put it there initially. So, I don't know. Thank you for coming.